Hi everyone, welcome to today's cooking class, Brunch at Home. This is being recorded and the recipes are linked in the chat and the BCal, and if you're watching the recording, we posted the recipe sheet online. So I'm going to grab my notes here, but this class was kind of inspired by the pandemic and all the things that we can't really do right now or haven't been able to do much in the past year. So you might be eating in restaurants now, or maybe you're not comfortable with that yet. So maybe you miss eating out and going to brunch, which is a really popular weekend activity here in the Bay Area and probably everywhere, honestly. So I wanted to do this class so you could kind of treat yourself at home and make a breakfast or brunch that's just a little extra special rather than just, same old bowl of cereal or boiled egg or whatever. So we have lots of great breakfast and brunch recipes on our Cookwell Berkeley site. Just to name a few, we have pancake recipes like blender banana pancakes and 2-ingredient sweet potato pancakes, shakshuka, which is an egg dish, tempeh sausage, pizza omelet, all kinds of things. So feel free to check out our Cookwell Berkeley page for more ideas. But what we're doing today is actually an all plant-based brunch. 2 of the recipes are from a website called Minimalist Baker, and we're going to be making some breakfast potatoes with added vegetables to make it a little extra nutritious. We're going to be making a tofu scramble as an alternative to an egg scramble, but you could also use eggs if you prefer. And then at the end, we're going to make a fun coffee drink that went viral in the past year. Maybe you've heard of it. So we're going to start with the breakfast potatoes. And for this recipe, we're going to use red potatoes. And we're going to leave the skin on. It tastes just fine with it. You get a little extra nutrients. And I know potatoes kind of have a bad reputation. There's a lot of, information and research out there. And the thing that makes it kind of hard to talk about potato nutrition is that here in the US, a lot of times potatoes are eaten as fries or with a lot of cheese and cream and things, so it's hard to study their health effects on their own. But they actually do offer some valuable nutrients like potassium and fiber. And they actually, one of the reasons why potatoes have a bad reputation is because they have a high glycemic index. And glycemic index doesn't really tell you everything about a food and how much it affects your blood sugar. Basically, it means if you eat this food alone, how much does it raise your blood sugar? But there's so many other factors that affect that, like, how it's prepared and what you eat it with. And the research is still kind of up in the air, but actually, red potatoes have a lower glycemic index than russet potatoes. Russet potatoes are high and red potatoes are actually more moderate. But for this recipe, it's not going to be all potatoes. We're kind of following our healthy meal model today, where about a quarter of your plate is a whole grain or starchy vegetable, a quarter is a protein, and about half is vegetables. So between the scramble and the vegetables and the potato, probably about half the meal will end up being non-starchy vegetables. So what I did is I left the skin on and I just cut them into kind of small, nice bite-sized pieces, about an inch or so. And as you may know, potatoes take a while to cook. So if we were to cook them from raw on the stove, it would take forever and they'd probably get kind of burnt before they're cooked on the inside. So we are going to quickly cook them for just a few minutes in the microwave. So I have it in a microwave safe container. I'm going to put a lid on this. And over here. I used my handy reusable silicone lid, and we're going to heat it for about 4 minutes. So I see this question about microwaves. If you don't have a microwave, asking how long do you boil them? I haven't tried that necessarily, but you want them to start to soften, basically. You don't want them to be fully cooked. So however long that takes, you probably just want to check with the fork. And once the fork starts to be able to go in, but doesn't just go right in super easily, that's probably when they're ready to be done. And then you would just drain them. Okay, so that's going to kind of pre-cook, par cook for about 4 minutes. All right. So, and also if you want to make this recipe a little bit more nutritious, you could also make it with sweet potatoes. So we cut up our potatoes, and then we're going to cook the onion and bell pepper. So for the onion, we need just 1/4 of a yellow onion. And we're going to use the other half for the tofu scramble. I just need 1/4. And we are going to roughly chop it. So kind of big pieces are okay because we're going to have big chunks of potatoes and bell peppers. So you kind of want everything around the same size just to make it look nice. Peel the skin off. Okay, so just a quick little chop there. And then we're also going to use bell pepper. You can use really any color you like, but personally, I like red, and I think it looks nice. And red bell peppers are actually a really good source of vitamin C. They actually have more vitamin C than an orange. And they also have vitamin B6 and fiber. And the red bell peppers are a significant source of carotenoids like beta carotene and another one that I don't know how to say, so we'll just skip that. So we're going to use the whole bell pepper roughly chopped, kind of like that, and we'll set that aside. I mean, this onion's kind of small. It doesn't look like a whole lot. You could use a little bit more if you want. It doesn't really matter. I also want to just give you a few tips on buying and storing your produce. So for bell peppers, I already cut it up, but it should be well-shaped, firm, and glossy. The skin should be taut and unwrinkled, and the stem should be fresh and green. They should have kind of thick walls. They should be actually heavy for their size. And of course, you want to avoid ones with spots that are sunken or kind of bruised. In terms of storage, you can store them unwashed in a plastic bag in the refrigerator for up to a week. And green peppers will last a little bit longer than the other colors. All right, so what we're going to do is we are going to cook the onion and the bell pepper first, and then we're going to take it out of the pan and cook the potatoes so that they have enough space to get nice and brown on all sides. So I'm going to use the cast iron skillet today. And we're going to saute the peppers and onions in a little bit of oil. I'm going to use canola oil, and we're going to start with 1 tablespoon. And it's okay to eyeball it if you want. So we're going to cook them for about 5 minutes. The potatoes are done microwaving. Then we're going to take them out of the pan, and then we're going to cook the potatoes. It says 3 tablespoons of oil. If that feels like a lot, you can start with, just 1 or 2 tablespoons. I gotta get a plate out so I can take out the peppers and onions when they're done cooking. And then we'll cook the potatoes for a few minutes, get them nice and browned on all sides, and then throw in the peppers and onions back in and seasoning, and then they'll be all ready. So let's grab the potatoes out. Okay, so here's the potatoes. Let's check them. So I don't know if you can really see that very well on the overhead camera, but my fork is going into the potato. There's definitely some resistance, but they're not raw anymore. It goes in, but there's definitely some resistance. So if you are boiling your potatoes instead of microwaving them, that's what you want to look for. I'm just set those aside for now. And my pan is hot, so I will throw in the onion first. And the bell pepper. So I can't really bring the camera over to the stove, but what I'll try to do periodically is just bring the pan over and show it to you on the overhead camera. All right, so while we are cooking that, we can get started on the scramble recipe. So like I mentioned, I'm trying to keep this class interactive, so feel free to ask your questions in the chat throughout, and my team will let me know if there's a really timely question. But I'm also going to be asking you some questions so you can respond.
Kim?
So the next question
Kim,
is...
this is Corey. Kim?
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Did you already answer the question about canola oil?
No, not yet.
Do you use canola oil because of the higher smoke point?
Yes, exactly. You could use olive oil, but olive oil kind of breaks down and smokes at a lower temperature than canola oil. And for this recipe, you want to get everything nice and browned. So I chose to use the canola oil. You could just keep the temperature lower and use olive oil too. So it's kind of up to you.
Can you substitute Yukon Gold potatoes?
Yeah, I think you can really use any kind of potatoes you like. Yeah, I've made this with russet potatoes too. I think really any kind of potatoes will work well. You could do a colorful mix like some blue potatoes and stuff. So whatever you prefer.
Wonderful. And we're going to put in the chat, but just to let everyone know, if you put your cameras on speaker view, you'll be able to see Kim and the cutting board.
Oh yeah, thank you. So if you have it on speaker view, you should have a split screen. And I think each individual has to set it that way. There's no way for us to do that. So my question for you all for the chat is, how do you like to incorporate vegetables into breakfast or brunch? And we had a few ideas, I think, in the chat earlier when we were talking about favorite brunch recipes. All right. So for the next recipe, we're making a Southwest Tofu Scramble. This recipe is also from Minimalist Baker. And it's basically like an egg scramble, just using tofu. So it's kind of a fun new way to use tofu creatively. For people who don't love the texture of tofu, this one you can't really tell as much. It's very similar to scrambled eggs. If you prefer eggs, you can also just use them in this recipe. That's totally fine. But I always like to show things that are a little fun and creative. So the first thing we're going to do is drain the tofu. We're using 1 package of extra firm tofu. Firm would be okay, but extra firm just means it has a little less water in it. It's a little bit easier. We want it to be dry. So I'm going to reveal why I have this towel here, not just as a backdrop for my spices, but it's to cover my laptop and to wrap up the tofu. So we're going to press it. And the nice thing about extra firm tofu is you don't have to press it quite as long. I'm going to just put something heavy on top of it. for a few minutes. You don't have to press it quite as long as firm tofu, so it just doesn't have quite as much liquid. So for the vegetables cooking on the stove, we just kind of want them to be cooked, mostly cooked, not overcooked, because we're going to heat them up a little bit more once we bring the potatoes back. So we want them to have a little bit of browning, especially the onions, but I do recommend not overcooking them at this point. So they're almost done. Okay, so the tofu is draining, and we're gonna let the recipe says let it sit for 15 minutes. I find you don't really have to wait that long for extra firm tofu, but we'll go ahead and get everything else ready. So the first thing we're gonna do is make a sauce. And rather than just throwing the spices in, I think the author of the recipe mixed it with a little water so it distributes more evenly. So we're basically just mixing the spices with a little bit of water. So we're going to use a teaspoon of garlic powder. I'm going to get all the little sprinkle things off of the lids. So 1 teaspoon of garlic powder. And a teaspoon of cumin. And you can customize these flavors however you want. This is supposed to be kind of a Southwest flavor, but if these aren't your favorite, then feel free to substitute other spices. We're going to use half a teaspoon of chili powder, and then it's optional. This isn't so much for flavor, it's more for the color. We're going to add some turmeric because it's going to give it that yellow, nice yellow color, kind of like eggs. So we're going to add a half a teaspoon of that.
Hey, Kim, this is Nicole.
Yeah.
There was another question about avocado oil and avocado oil having a high smoke point. If you can chat more about that.
Yeah. Real quick, I'm just going to add the salt. We need half a teaspoon of salt and just enough water to thin this out. Yeah, there's a lot of different types of oil out there, and they all have different smoke points. It's fairly complicated because olive oil, for example, it depends on how the olives are processed and where they're from, so many different things. But I believe avocado oil does have one of the higher smoke points, which means it's good for high heat cooking. It's also a little more expensive. So there's lots of different options, but you can find something that works for you in terms of your budget and whatever it is you're cooking. I typically keep at home in terms of cooking oils are an extra virgin olive oil for things like salad dressing, low heat cooking, roasting in the oven, canola oil for high heat cooking, or for baking like a cake or something. The olive oil has kind of too strong of a flavor for that, although there are olive oil cake recipes out there. Sometimes canola oil or coconut oil also for baking or certain things. Those are kind of the 3 that I like to keep at home. But there's lots and lots of different options out there. Okay, so what I did is I just removed the peppers and onions from the pan. I'll put them here so you can see. They're kind of a little bit browned and not overcooked yet. And then I'm going to add more oil to the pan. You can eyeball this. I still have some oil left over from the vegetables, so I don't want to do too much or anything. So I'm going to add maybe another tablespoon, and then I'm adding the potatoes. And I'm going to put them in a single layer so they start to get browned on all sides. And there's a lot of ways you can do this. You can roast the potatoes part of the way and then throw them in the pan. You can roast potatoes the whole way. You can roast the vegetables and the potatoes. These won't take as long as the potatoes, so you just have to watch them. So however you want to do it is really fine. I just like this way in particular because it's a little bit quicker, and it seems to give a nice crisp edge on the potatoes, which I think is a key thing for breakfast potatoes. Okay, so we have our sauce here for the tofu. It's at this point, it's kind of a paste. So I'm going to add a little more water to make it more of a sauce so that it just covers the tofu really well and evenly. So now you can see it's kind of a watery sauce. So we'll set that aside for now, and we'll prepare the other vegetables. So we are going to use the other half of the yellow onion. I have made this with red onion, and after I stored the leftovers, the red onion turned a really unpleasant color. So if you're going to eat it fresh, it's fine. But if you're planning on making this ahead, I would try to stick to the yellow onion just for aesthetics if you can. But if not, it's not a big deal. So we are going to thinly slice it. And actually, I only got out one bell pepper. I need to go grab one more real quick. So if you're making these two dishes together, which I definitely recommend, they go great together, you're going to use 2 bell peppers. So if you want, you can buy 1 green and 1 red, or 1 yellow and 1 red, whatever colors you like, and mix them, match them in both recipes. Okay. So then for the bell pepper, we're also going to thinly slice it. So we're going to cut it in half and just scoop out the middle, peel off the white parts and the seeds. I like to kind of shake it over the sink, give it a tap to get all the extra seeds out, just because they're kind of bitter. And we're going to thinly slice it. Look really pretty in our dish. This one actually has a little bit of bruise spots, so I'm just going to chop that out. And then you'll want to keep an eye on the potatoes. You want to kind of cook them on each side for a few minutes until they start to brown a little bit. All right, so if you're using a cast iron skillet that isn't super well seasoned, like mine is not, you do have to make sure you use enough oil so it doesn't stick, because once potatoes start sticking, it's game over, it's a mess. So just keep that in mind. But if you have a non-stick pan, it'll be a little bit easier. Okay, so once the potatoes are done, I'm going to use the same pan. That's pretty much the only kind of non-stick type pan that I have. So we'll just get everything else ready. So we're also going to use kale. And you can use other greens if you prefer. That's just what this recipe calls for. But it is going to look really nice with the red bell pepper. It's going to be like a red, yellow, and green dish. And I'm using kind of the regular curly kale, but you could also use the other types, like the more flat leaf one. And this is the method that I like to use for removing the kale from the stem. This works for pretty much any leafy greens like chard and other hardy greens. Just kind of pulling the leaves right off the stem. It's really easy. No need to cut them off or anything. You can also eat the stems. They're just a little tough, so I prefer to take them off. Right, so I'm going to throw Take a second to throw everything in my compost bin. Okay, so it calls for 4 cups of kale, and I think this one bunch is quite a bit more than that. So I'm gonna just kind of roughly chop it on the side here and throw it into another bowl. That was what, 3 leaves or so. This is probably at least 3 or 4 cups, and it's going to cook down, so you don't have to cut it into tiny pieces or anything. You can also eyeball it, doesn't have to be perfect. But yeah, you can use other greens if you like spinach or collard greens, whatever you'd like. All right, so let's check on our tofu here. So the water, most of the water has been pressed out of it. So I'm gonna grab actually another bowl, and we're gonna crumble it. And that's going to make it like scrambled eggs. So I do recommend pressing it, even though the extra firm doesn't have a whole lot of water, because it'll help it crisp up in the pan, get a little bit of nice browning on it. Okay, so I don't know if you can see that now, but it's texture-wise sort of resembles some scrambled eggs. And then once we cook it and add the seasoning, it'll look even more like it. You're not going to be fooling anybody, and that's not the point of this, but it is just kind of a fun way to use tofu. So let's flip our potatoes again. And if you want, you can kind of flip them individually if you can tell that it's not browning on a certain side. If you want, you can kind of micromanage your potatoes like that. You can also use tongs to flip them. So they look nice when you get them browned on all the sides. All right, so those maybe just need a few more minutes. So we pretty much have everything ready for our scramble. It takes maybe 7-8 minutes or so to cook, so we still have time to make it in the same pan. So I'm just gonna leave everything aside here, and maybe we can get started on the coffee. So today we're gonna be making Dalgona Coffee, which went viral last year. It originated in South Korea, and it was really big on like TikTok and Instagram and all those social media platforms. And it's basically a whipped coffee, and it just looks really fun and cool. So it's a nice way to treat yourself to something special. So I'm going to keep an eye on those potatoes, but basically the standard recipe is equal parts warm water, sugar, and instant coffee. And I personally don't like coffee super sweet. I think it takes away from that nice coffee flavor, but also instant coffee is pretty bitter, so it doesn't always taste great without a little bit of sweetener, unless you like it that way, and that's totally fine. So you do have to use instant coffee for this recipe. It doesn't work with brewed coffee. It just isn't going to whip up. You can, of course, make instant coffee however you'd like, but for this particular whipped coffee, it only works with instant. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a little hand mixer, and we're going to whip it up like you would whipped cream or meringue or any kind of foam. But first, I'm going to keep checking on these potatoes.
Kim, did you already answer the question?
What is it?
There's a question in the chat related to the sweet or regular yellow onions for specific dishes.
Mm-hmm.
You have a preference?
You have a preference? Not really. I tend to just keep yellow onions in the house and use those for everything. But yeah, I would say it's kind of more of a personal preference as far as I know. So the potatoes are mostly browned on all the sides, so I'm going to add back the peppers and onions. And we're also going to season them. We're going to use a teaspoon of salt and half a teaspoon of garlic powder. You can start with less salt if you'd like to. Potatoes do tend to take quite a bit of salt to taste, right. But you can definitely start with a little less than that. I'll start with half a teaspoon. And then just some black pepper, about half a teaspoon. So I'm just going to crack the pepper right over it here. Mix that up. You can also season a little earlier to let it stick. If you have cooking spray, you can also spray the potatoes and throw the seasoning on, and that will just help it stick a little better. Okay, so I'm going to keep that pan out for the tofu, but I'll just bring the potatoes over here. We'll wait. We'll come back to the coffee. So here are the breakfast potatoes all done. So you can see that was pretty quick compared to some other potato recipes. Okay, so let's get started cooking the tofu scramble. So it calls for 2 tablespoons of olive oil in the pan. So that pan is still hot from just cooking the potatoes. So we are going to throw in the peppers and onion, cook those a little bit. All right. So we're going to cook those for, I just add them all together. The recipe says do the onion first. It's not really a big deal. Cook those until they start to brown a little bit. Then we'll add the kale, let it steam for a couple of minutes, and then we'll add the tofu. My dog is always under me in the kitchen. I just tripped over her. Okay. So kale is ready, sauce is ready, tofu is ready. This is how I like to cook when I have the patience, just having everything all ready to go. So when it's time, you just throw it all in, no stress. So I think we can maybe do the coffee and multitask here. So instead of doing equal parts of the sugar, coffee, and water, we're going to basically cut the sugar in half because then it's not so sweet. I think it's a little overly sweet with that much sugar. So this serves 2. So we're going to use 2 tablespoons of instant coffee. And 1 serving of instant coffee is 1 to 2 teaspoons. And there's 3 teaspoons in a tablespoon. So basically, this is 3 to 6 servings of coffee. So it's pretty strong. I'm personally using decaf coffee because I think it's a lot of caffeine. If you're not used to that, there is some caffeine in decaf. In order to be decaf, it has to have 97% of the caffeine removed. So it does still have some. So I'm adding 1 tablespoon of granulated sugar since we're doing 2 parts coffee to 1 part sugar. So we're going to use a stir here. And you might be wondering, oh, is coffee healthy? I've heard all kinds of mixed messages on coffee. And basically, a lot of the things that coffee has sort of been accused of have turned out not to really be the case. It actually may have quite a few health benefits. I'll talk about in just a second, but we're going to need 2 tablespoons of warm water. So I'm just going to put that in a little bowl. I could have put it right in the glass that I'm measuring everything in. Just heat it up for a few seconds. That basically just helps everything dissolve really well so that it's nice and combined. And make sure when you do this, you use a bowl that's about 4 times the size of the ingredients that you're putting in there, because we're making a foam. It's going to whip up a lot. So I also recommend using something that's kind of deep, especially if you're cutting this recipe in half. If you use too wide of a bowl, it's just going to go around the sides and nothing's really going to happen. So you want it deep enough that you can really incorporate some air here. Okay, so those are about to start browning a little bit. Once that happens, we're going to add the kale. So I'm going to go ahead and throw the kale in now. And then we're just going to cover it and steam it for a couple of minutes. So I'm using a hand mixer here, and hopefully you'll be able to see what this does. So this might be a little loud. You might want to turn your volume down, but I'm going to start off low, okay? That's probably going to be loud, so I'm going to go ahead and mute myself. And I'm going to turn the speed way up, and it'll whip in about a minute. So I'm sorry if that's a little boring. But let me go ahead and put a question for you. My next question is, I'll ask a couple at once. Have you ever tried tofu for breakfast? If so, what did you make? And have you tried Dalgona coffee? And what did you think? Or really any other viral food trends? So feel free to talk to each other in the chat while I do this. Okay, so I don't know if you could see that on the camera, but this was like barely visible, a really dark brown liquid. And as it whipped up, you can also see on the overhead, it's a thick foam. It's really thick. It's basically got stiff peaks at this point. So let me set that aside. I'm going to check on the vegetables.
Hey, Kim, it's Nicole. When you get the chance, I have another question from the chat for you.
Okay. Give me 1 second, so I can't hear that well over here. Okay. Just so I'm not multitasking too much, let me just finish the tofu scramble really quick. So what we're going to do is push the vegetables to one side of the pan. I can tell the kale has steamed because it's like a bright green, looks really pretty. So we're just going to push everything to the side, make some room for the tofu. I'm going to add a little bit more oil just to make sure the tofu doesn't stick. Tofu can be really sticky. It'll make a mess in this pan. So I'm going to put the tofu in. And then we're going to saute it for a couple of minutes to start browning it a little bit. And there's probably going to be some water in the tofu, but as you cook it, it will start to cook out. And you can always push down on the tofu a little bit. That will release more of the water and it'll evaporate as steam. Okay, Nicole, what's the other question?
There was a question earlier about coconut oil. Is it healthy or is it artery clogging because it's solid at room temperature?
That's a really good question. I would say the jury's still out on that one. We used to think all saturated fat was bad, and basically saturated fat is solid at room temperature. Most food sources of fat have a variety of fats between unsaturated and saturated. There's kind of a little bit in all the types of oils that we talked about and, animal fats, but things like coconut oil, palm oil, animal fat tend to be mostly saturated, but it's not quite so simple. There's different types of saturated fat, and we're still learning quite a bit about them. From what I've read, some of the research on coconut oil shows that it may be more neutral, the types of fat that's in coconut oil. I wouldn't say at this point we can say, oh, it's good for you and eat as much as you want. I think we should, kind of just eat it in moderation. For example, I like to use it in baking, and I'm using it to replace butter. I really doubt it's worse or less good for your health than butter. So I would say it's fine to use. I wouldn't, I would probably use a variety of other oils because variety in your diet is always good, whether we're talking about vegetables or fruits or whole grains. There's just different nutrients and more variety is always better. So I'd say it's fine to use for certain purposes in the kitchen. So just to finish off the scramble, actually, what we're going to do after we get a little bit of browning on the tofu is to add the sauce. So mine is starting to brown a tiny bit. You can also go ahead and mash it up more to make it more scrambled looking. I'm going to let it get a little bit browner. I like a little bit of crust on there. But we can go ahead and finish the coffee. So I went ahead and threw some ice in here. So I have these ice trays that are really hard to get out, so I didn't want to spend 5 minutes doing that. But we're just going to pour a little bit of milk over ice in a glass, and I'm using oat milk. You can use whatever kind of milk or milk alternative you want. And then we're going to take our coffee foam. You can use a spatula, a spoon, whatever. Sometimes I like to use a cookie scoop, just so it keeps it nice and neat. And I don't know if you can see how thick that is. I'll make a little extra. Then you can put a glass on it. So there you have a whipped coffee. It's somewhat sweet, but you can reduce the sugar a little bit. You can't take the sugar out completely. It won't hold the foam, and it'll probably be really bitter. So this is just when you want kind of a fun treat. You can see the overhead camera, but we've got a really, it's kind of fogged up there. We have a thick mousse. So when you want to drink it, you're just going to stir it up to incorporate all that. And you'll still probably end up with some on the top. But especially now as we get into the warmer months, it's just kind of a fun coffee drink that maybe you don't have every day, but hey, on the weekend or a day when you want to pick me up or you're cooking brunch for friends and you want to impress them, this will definitely impress them. All right, so let's check on the tofu. I'm going to push down on it a little bit with a spatula. That's going to help bring out more of the water. But I'm going to go ahead and pour the sauce over the tofu. Give that a stir. Okay, so I'm going to let it cook a little bit more before I combine everything. But I don't know if you can see how yellow the tofu is now. And it's also going to taste really good because it's got all those Southwest spices in there. So if you want to make this recipe with eggs, you don't have to add turmeric because the egg's already yellow. If you like the flavor, then feel free. So you'll just want to probably don't cook the eggs quite as long, just use your judgment and just wait until they're fully cooked. But you would add them at the same time when you add the tofu. They're definitely going to be a different consistency, right? They're going to be runny, whereas the tofu was already kind of thickened. So maybe better to take the vegetables out and scramble eggs in the pan and then add the vegetables back. But another good thing about the tofu is if you want to make this ahead of time, it holds up pretty well. Whereas the thought of scrambled eggs a couple days old just doesn't sound very good, but the tofu in a couple days is really just as good as it is now. Also wanted to mention the benefits of using tofu because soy protein, when used in place of animal protein, can or may help lower total and LDL cholesterol and triglycerides without lowering LDL or HDL, sorry, without lowering HDL, your good cholesterol. Soy foods are also naturally low in saturated fat, and soybeans are a rich source of B vitamins, including thiamine, riboflavin, B6, and folate, and provides iron, potassium, magnesium, and cholesterol-lowering plant sterols. They're also one of the few dietary sources of isoflavones, which may promote bone health. Quickly wanted to talk about kale too. A lot of people think of kale as a super health food. If you don't love it or you're sick of it because the last 10 years have been all about kale, then feel free to use other greens. But it is a cruciferous vegetable, which is, this one in particular is high in vitamin K, which is good for your bones, and has beta carotene, which converts to vitamin A, has potassium, some other nutrients. You notice a lot of these things I mentioned have potassium. Most people do not get enough potassium because, you might think of bananas are a good source of potassium, but you would have to eat 10 bananas a day to get enough potassium. So there's just not really any single food that has a ton of potassium in it. So the key really is to eat a lot of different foods, including fruits and vegetables, going back to what I said earlier about variety, to get enough potassium, which is good for your blood pressure. We think of sodium as it can raise your blood pressure, and potassium can kind of help balance it out. Not that you can just eat all the salt you want if you eat enough potassium, but it's an important nutrient for a lot of reasons, and most of us don't get enough. And kale is also a good source of vitamin C. 1 cup cooked has almost a day's worth of vitamin C, which is not a nutrient that many people have trouble getting enough of because there's a lot of it in a lot of different foods. All right, so we're going to give this a stir to combine everything. I think I can bring this over here. So that is our Southwest Tofu Scramble. Put that on a plate with some breakfast potatoes. We have a colorful, plant-based, filling, savory, not spicy, but spiceful, I guess, if that's a word, breakfast or brunch, and pair it with a coffee, and it's extra special. So that is everything. So I didn't get a really chance to talk about coffee and its effect on health. Long story short, it may reduce risk of a lot of different types of disease, but you don't want to do too much because that is a lot of caffeine and may have negative health effects. Pregnant women should also limit their caffeine, but if you enjoy coffee, it is okay to consume it. So I'll stick around if there's any other questions, but I think that's all the time we have. So we can go ahead and end the recording, and hopefully we'll see you at some of our future classes.